So very much as we did with Sullivan and with Le Corbusier, this talk is about Robert Venturi as a theoretician and practitioner. How did the theory convert into practice? And again, we're going to be going from the notes that you have, and we'll be looking at 8 topics, Roman numeral 1 through 8, and then looking at buildings that exemplify those notions in Venturi's theory, and see how that turned into work in his practice. I do want to emphasize that the whole point of this talk is to provoke you to think about discussion. And in class, we're going to really be talking about these points in much more depth. So you should be thinking in your head, what is my reaction? What do I think about that as an idea? And how might I talk about that in our discussion? So we're talking about Robert Venturi today. This is him in his 40s on the left and in his 80s on the right. He died only a couple of years ago at the ripe age of 93. A very, very long and productive career. What we're seeing on the left here is Robert Venturi with Denise Scott Brown and John Rauch. This was when the firm was Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown. As I mentioned, Denise and Robert, very, very much a pair, and eventually it was Venturi and Scott Brown as the firm. I wanted at the beginning here to just look at their own home. This is the house they lived in for decades in Chestnut Hill, just outside of Philadelphia. And we're going to look at a number of slides, several of this one room. And I think it just says so much to me about what Bob and Denise were up to, what they thought, how they felt. And they lived very much the way they thought architecture should be. So, you know, some people would look at that room and, I don't know, maybe think that looks like grandma's room or something. But this is a very, very well put together, erudite, beautifully composed assembly of things. And they did love things, the Venturis. So there is this beautiful, really wonderful Tiffany lamp. That's the real deal. Really great Tiffany lamp there. There is a Biedermeier grandfather clock that is gorgeous, early 19th century German piece of furniture, gorgeous antique piece there. This is a 1970s Parsons table. That was kind of the cool thing in the 1970s. But every piece in here is beautifully selected and assembled in a very, very eclectic way. These 2 shots are that very same room. Over on the other side, we have a light beer sign and a Desert Inn sign from Las Vegas. They, of course, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi wrote the book Learning from Las Vegas. So these are kind of appreciating that moment in their life. But right on the other side of the room are these very, very expensive Piranesi drawing. This is his love of things Italian. And then this Roy Lichtenstein, very expensive Roy Lichtenstein piece there. The Lichtenstein and the Piranesi, 2 drawings of different eras, both of them very, very fine, very high quality, but sitting kind of comfortably, but with a little tension there together. More Biedermeier furniture here. So, you know, and they would have done all of the decoration on the walls here. They took an old house and they completely redid it with this idea of things very, very eclectic. So here we can see Andy Warhol, more Biedermeier pieces, a Frank Lloyd Wright table here, very fine things. And then around the top, this decoration that would have shown a lot of their favorite architects, Palladio, Michelangelo, Sir John Soane, Borromini. I think it's just interesting to see how they lived and what they thought were great things to have them around them in their own home. So let's look at these 8 issues that I spoke about. And the first of them is really, I think, a key issue in the book, what is the role of history or precedent in architecture? And let me read you a couple of things they said about that. Again, I should really say this is Bob saying this, because this is prior to his knowing Denise Scott Brown. So the book is really prior to Denise Scott Brown. But these are things he's saying, and I think very much exemplify the ideas they brought to practice together. So he says, familiar things seen in an unfamiliar context become perpetually new as well as old. And he quotes from T.S. Eliot when he says, the historic sense involves perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. So what can you take from architectural history and rework and rethink and recontextualize to make it meaningful and beautiful and new? So these are 2 houses that Venturi did early in his career, the Tribeca and Wislocky houses. They're in Nantucket. Nantucket Island is a really gorgeous spot just off the coast of Massachusetts, and it's filled with little fishing houses like this. Almost all of them made of shingles, shingle roofs, shingle walls, little salt box houses. There are hundreds of them on Nantucket. It's a very historic environment there. So he's building 2 new houses, but these are not fishermen's houses. These are vacation houses for wealthy people from New York. And they're interested in the scenery and the beauty of Nantucket. So they want not little tiny windows like the fishermen's houses had, but big, broad expanses of glass, big windows that would let in lots of light and give beautiful views to the dunes and to the ocean around. So the scale is shifted. We get the sense of the past in these little salt box houses. But now we also get contemporary needs very much melded into that and made kind of seamless in the composition. So a porch, which would probably have been a tiny little porch in a fisherman's house, now gets to be a kind of outdoor living room and a much bigger gesture that kind of eats into the salt box of that house. Windows that are gigantic compared to what the scale of a window would have been in those historic homes. And things like a beautiful kind of Palladian window up in the master bedroom, beautiful views, lots of light, but combining new things with old forms, and out of that producing something that is appropriately referential, but also appropriately new. This is the living room just off of that porch we were just talking about. And of course, it's all glass on 3 sides there, so you get beautiful panoramic views out to the ocean. So that it's combining 2 things, old things and new things, in making these homes. So that first item is, what is an appropriate attitude toward history or precedent? Something we should be discussing in class. A second issue that is a very big issue in the book is what is modernism up to? What is the relevance of modernism to a new age that is after the certainly heroic period of modernism? And Venturi says, architects can no longer afford to be intimidated by the puritanically moral language of orthodox modern architecture. At that point, it's very clear what you did to be a modernist. And he said it's negative. We can't afford to be tied down by this orthodox language. He said the tradition either or has characterized orthodox modern architecture. An architecture of complexity and contradiction tends to include both and rather than exclude either or. So whereas the language of modern architecture was very simplified, very narrow at that point, Venturi is saying we ought to have a broader range of vocabulary in order to really solve relevant architectural problems of our era. So he's very interested in looking at everyday buildings by everyday people and looking at what they're referring to. And this is an exhibition that they did on just everyday suburban places. And out of some of those studies, he begins to expand his vocabulary from what was orthodox modern architecture to be broader than that. So in this house he did for his mother, you get really the sort of classic gabled roof of a house. You get the central chimney of a house. You get the front door, although you come in and slide around to the side here. So there are things about this that are certainly not modern. But then there also are elements of this that are incorporating the good things of modernism into it. It's just broadening the vocabulary. So here we get, aluminum sliding glass doors, things that are very, very modern. So mom can have a nice view out to the backyard and do indoor-outdoor dining here. That makes sense. But there also are very traditional kind of forms, like a big fireplace with a big mantle over the fireplace. And then there is this notion of inclusion. So that becomes both a fireplace and a little stair that slips you up to this attic room up there at the top. That was a craft room for his mom. Is a bedroom in this photograph. But this notion of we don't have to be hemmed in by that old vocabulary. We can expand the vocabulary beyond what it's been. Another example of that would be the Brandt House that he did in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1972. This one is the much bigger, much grander house. And it's almost Palladian in the way that there's a big lawn that goes down here. It's on a big piece of land. That symmetrical facade, the bowed facade, this beautiful vista to the house as you drive in. But alongside that, which is more Palladian than it is modern, you get this, which is modern. This is ribbon window, stuck up on pilotis, not so different from the Villa Savoye that we looked at last time. Many different eras of architecture represented here, a kind of trellis made out of a kind of Regency material, brick that reminiscent of sort of WPA projects, kind of 1930s material. For Venturi, you need to expand the vocabulary. And in particular for this client who had a very sophisticated Art Deco furniture collection, that clock, this whole ensemble there. But alongside, Andy Warhol art, Leger up here. I mean, very, very eclectic combination of elements within the house that the people had collected, and the house was meant to receive those all graciously and embrace them in this kind of larger vocabulary of what architecture might be. So that's on the notion of this narrow vocabulary of modernism and busting out of it. A third issue he talks about is on building materials and products. And again, let me read a little of what he says. He says, I'm interested in the vast accumulation of standard, anonymously designed products connected with architecture and construction, and also to commercial display elements which are positively banal and vulgar in themselves and are seldom associated with architecture. The main justification for these honky-tonk elements in architectural order is their very existence. They are what we have. These commonplace elements accommodate existing need for variety and communication. So he's making the advocacy for looking at everyday things around us, what he calls honky-tonk elements. So in this project he did, which is called Guild House, was done in 1964. He's just, it's an urban environment. It's kind of a gritty part of Philadelphia. And this was low-income housing. So it's not a glamorous project at all, and it has to be very economical. And so he says, I'm just going to use ordinary building materials, double-hung windows, which no one in modern architecture would use a double-hung window. but that's inexpensive and it's off the shelf and it's very practical. So he's using double hung windows. He's using standard pieces that you could find made out of metal for a handrail. He's using signage that looks like it could be on a supermarket. Again, it's what we have. It's what we communicate with. So he's taking everyday things in the environment and recomposing them to make something new and fresh. He got in a lot of trouble over that TV antenna, which, again, a kind of everyday kind of thing that's all over. Why can't we make that a part of architecture? That's what he's saying, these everyday items that are everywhere. So he puts it right in the center and makes it a kind of part of that monumental facade. This is the TV room up there where the elderly people that lived in this low-income community might be watching TV, and that was meant to kind of celebrate the fact these people watch a lot of TV. And people thought that was a little, I don't know, negative or cruel, but he's just saying, hey, let's just talk about what's out there. What is in the environment? How can we use it to contribute to architecture? Guildhouse has an amazingly simple and practical plan. It's extremely efficient, small apartments that are off of this little corridor right there, all of them with really good views into, mostly private views into these little courtyards on either side. It's a very generous kind of plan and arrangement of rooms. So again, the idea is, can we stretch beyond that orthodox modern architectural vocabulary? Can we look at just things around us, things in the building industry like double hung windows, things in the commercial world like signage and TV antennas, and can those contribute to architecture as well? Okay, a fourth idea that he discusses, and that's really on American values and culture, and about, again, what is out there? What's there in pop culture, in everyday life? He says, is not Main Street almost all right? Indeed, is not the commercial strip of Route 66 almost all right? So these things that architects were damning, just normal commercial environments, he said, you know, we've got to deal with this. We can't ignore it. And you know, with some tweaking, could this be almost all right? So he does this building, the Institute for Scientific Information, on one of those just kind of strip streets in Philadelphia. And he tries to run with it. Okay, what is a big street full of cars and eclectic combination of crazy buildings? How could you play off that kind of vital, active, lively, not particularly well composed or classically beautiful kind of environment, but can you make architecture that actually runs with it, that feels comfortable in that environment, and then in fact takes elements like signage and billboards and uses them as a springboard for making architectural form? So again, how can we use the vernacular everyday environment around us as an inspiration for architectural form? A fifth issue that he brings up is talking about architecture as an expression of function. And again, this is something Sullivan introduced in that first reading in Kindergarten Chats, form follows function. Every major theorist since then has dealt with somehow this relationship between form and function. Here's what Venturi says. This is actually a comment by Vincent Scully in the introduction to the book, talking about Venturi's position. He says, Venturi does not lie to us once concerning what the facts are. In the straightest sense, it is function that interests him, and the strong forms deriving from functional expression. So he's very, very interested in function. Venturi himself says, I emphasize the complexity and contradiction that develops from the program and reflects the inherent complexities and contradictions of living. It is obvious that in actual practice, the two must be interrelated. So the notion is not to make complexity and contradiction for its own sake, but that living is complex. Living is contradictory. And if we really take all of that serious, it's going to make a physical environment that has that complexity and contradiction honestly and appropriately a part of it. So let's look at this a kind of major work. And now we're getting into the Venturi and Scott Brown kind of era. This is when he and Denise Scott Brown are very much partners in all of the buildings that follow here. Really the ISI building to some extent as well. But here he's doing an addition to a museum that was designed by Cass Gilbert. So Cass Gilbert's the same guy that did Battle Hall on the UT campus. At about the same time, he's doing the museum on the Oberlin campus in Ohio. And Venturi's coming along and he's doing an addition of more exhibition space for the museum, and then a large addition for the art school, including a library and studio spaces. So 3 different functions. This is accommodating traditional art in traditional rooms. This is for their expanded modern and contemporary art collection, quite distinct in scale and in kind of art from this, different function. And then third is the school, the pedagogical part of the operation, and very clearly 3 completely different functions and volumes and skin treatment. So you can see from the major street here, you get the old building, the new exhibition space, and the academic building. Just to the right here on the other side is a performing arts center done by Harrison and Abramovitz in the 1960s. And this relates very much to the 1960s building over here, just as this relates more to the early 20th century building right there. So the older building is made out of a combination of granite and this red sandstone. The addition is now in a kind of pop art way, taking that material, flattening it, making it a little more visually bold, like pop art tended to do, but making something that relates, but is still distinctly different in the addition that is the exhibition room there. And in front there's this Klaus Oldenburg piece, which is really kind of doing the same thing. That is changing the scale, abstracting, but taking something that's familiar and already there. And then from that addition of the gallery piece, we get the addition of the pedagogical wing with the library on the main floor, studios down below, studios up above. And again, it's function that is driving the buildings. Each of those pieces is very clearly about what goes on inside. So this one is those, you just need big, well-lit library space there, big, well-lit studio spaces down below, big loft spaces, the studios are open, the library is open, big singular spaces. That's very different from the exhibition space, which needs lots of wall space at eye height, and then needs light that is now, natural light comes in, bounces down, is filtered, and becomes good ambient light inside the room. So it's function that's being expressed there. We have the old museum, the new addition of the gallery there, and then the library on the main floor and studios above and below there. That's what that exhibition space looked like when it was opened in 1977. Again, huge, very different kinds of paintings and sculpture than were in the old building. And the room and the space and the scale all reflect that. This clever kind of lighting system, just a simple clear story window, then with a kind of milky plexiglass to bounce off of and give this kind of soft light on the inside of the room. And there it is more recently. But again, housing a kind of art that's very different from the older building. So again, it's function that's driving these very different expressions in different parts of the building, and this complexity and contradiction. Those 3 elements are not so comfortable together. They sometimes contradict each other. But then sometimes the kind of art that's in this building is really, really different from the kind of art that's in that building. So shouldn't that be expressed? Or the function of this studio and library is really very different from the function of that exhibition space. Isn't it appropriate to express that? He's not looking for an artificial complexity and contradiction, but an authentic complexity and contradiction. So a sixth item that he talks about is this relationship between inside and outside. And I think he has amazing observations about architecture really as the thing that mitigates between the inside and the outside. So he says, architecture occurs at the meeting of interior and exterior forces of use and space. These interior and environmental forces are both general and particular, generic and circumstantial. Architecture as the wall between the inside and the outside becomes the special record of this resolution and its drama. So really a major role of architecture in his mind is to take all the functions that are on the inside and all the forces of the context around and to express both of those things honestly and let that wall, the exterior wall of the architecture, respond to both of those things. So to look at that issue, we're going to look at a building he did at Princeton. He, of course, got both his undergraduate and his graduate degree from Princeton. He then went on to do probably half a dozen buildings at Princeton. This one that we're going to talk about is Wu Hall, which was the first he did there. But you have to kind of understand the Princeton campus is very, very eclectic. It's got some very distinguished neo-Gothic buildings. It's got some very distinguished Richardsonian Romanesque buildings. It's got some very distinguished classical buildings. It's got some very distinguished modern buildings. It's a crazy-ass kind of eclectic campus. So it's not like there's one kind of style that seems right on the Princeton campus. And in particular, the area where the building, where Wu Hall was going to be located, is just a mishmash. There is this Hugh Stubbins building from the 1960s, which is a dormitory building, a modern building. There's this interesting building that's in a way kind of modern, but also with these kind of neo-Gothic ornament around the windows. And then there's a Georgian building, a pretty solidly Georgian building that is immediately adjacent to Wu Hall. So he's trying to pull together, he's trying to look at the context, the environment around the building, and make a building that will respond to that, but also respond to the functions on the inside. So this is Wu Hall. It was done in 1983. From one part of the campus, you'll go down this beautiful walkway lined with trees. This is a major route through the Princeton campus. And as you go down that major route, his site was right at the end of it. So he sticks the building out and just grabs a kind of axis, something to terminate the axis with that rounded window right there. And that's what we're seeing here. So he's taking the environmental condition, the context, and he's making the building respond to that axis from one direction. Then there's another major path that comes in the other direction right here from a completely different side of the building. We were looking on the opposite side of the building, coming to the other end of the building. But here you can see, again, he uses a rounded window, a different rounded window, as a termination for that axis. So that becomes a kind of emblem that takes two major axes of the campus and kind of draws them into this site. And then this is that kind of Georgian building that is immediately next door. He uses the brick from that Georgian building. He uses the limestone trim from that Georgian building. So he's using materials from the immediate context. He's using shapes that are determined by the kind of urban context. And then from one of those rounded windows to the other rounded window, between them is this court, this long, thin court. So you would have come along an axis terminated on that round window, or from the other direction along an axis terminated on this round window. And then in between those two is this long, thin court, and that's where you enter the building right there. Now, this was a very interesting program too. It was, they used to have at Princeton what they called dining clubs or something like that, but where the dormitories did not have dining halls, and you would be, it's like a fraternity, you would be admitted as a member of a dining club, and you would have your meals at, I think the freshmen had all their meals in a kind of freshman area, but then for upperclassmen, they'd go to their dining club for their meals. But this was a snooty, selective kind of thing, and it got to seem not very egalitarian. And some people didn't get invited to be in the club they wanted to be in, and so now they're having all their meals with somebody they don't want to have their meals with, and so it wasn't a good thing. So Princeton got rid of all the dining clubs, and they said, now we're going to put dining in the dormitories. So this Wu Hall was a dining facility for a number of different dorms that were around there. So like 4 dorms shared this dining facility. So its primary function is as a dining facility on the lower floor. But then it also has, recreation rooms and, places to play pool or, kind of student center kinds of activities that would be there as well. So on that long court, there is a kind of front door here where you enter into the building, and it's marked by that, again, kind of pop art graphic. So as you come down here on that major walk, you've got an obelisk that turns your attention to this long court, and then along that court you can see the front door right there, and that would be the major entry point for maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 dorms that would all come in and commonly use that dining hall. And on the ground floor, it's really just a dining hall at one end. These are the upper floor and the lower floor, but on the main floor, it's a dining room. There's a kind of reception area, and then there's this big stair hall that takes you up to the upper floor, which is all these kind of club rooms and gathering spaces, little library, and then the lower floor where, again, there are recreation rooms and gathering rooms. But the main event there is this big dining hall. And at the end of the dining hall is one of those half-round windows, which is where high table would be for the dining hall. There you're seeing right there that kind of focus of the whole dining hall on that half-round window. And then at the other end is this stairwell that takes you up. And it's a social stair, so people can park their gear along here, or they can sit, and that becomes a kind of amphitheater for that entry hall. But that half-round window that's at the other end of the building is a major internal landmark there. So those 2 half-round windows that had an urban generation that really came from the outside in also have very much an internal generation. It's where the stair goes, turns around, and continues up. It's where the high table sits at the end of the dining room. So it's the outside in and inside out. This one being a landmark as you come up to that part of the campus, but also being very much from the inside, the place where the high table is and a major kind of focus of the dining room. So it's this point, you've got to think of architecture as this thing that's inside out and outside in. The 7th point I want to highlight here is on the idea of simplicity and order versus complexity. He says, the movement from a view of life as essentially simple and orderly to a view of life as complex and ironic is what every individual passes through in becoming mature. He's saying that's part of our own personal development, but it also is maybe the differentiation between kind of dumb, simple architecture, one-liner architecture, architecture that's absorbed easily and then becomes a little boring, or architecture that continues to have a life and generation and complexity that you can see over and over again and see in different ways, and different people can see in different ways. So he's looking for this kind of layering of meaning, much more rich and complex architecture. A great example of that is his Seattle Art Museum, which he did in 1991. And again, with Denise Scott Brown. Very, very much this is Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, especially in this building. But it's got many, many layers of meaning. It is expressing the function of the building. Obviously, on the lower floor, there's lots of penetration. And this is where you go into the building. And it sits on two streets, one which is a full story lower than the one on the other side. So all of that area becomes a kind of entry and penetrable part of the museum. And that's, a major function of the museum. And then there's a middle of the museum that really is about exhibition space. And you don't really want a lot of windows. You want wall space for exhibition of materials. And then at the very top, that's like education spaces and rooms where they are teaching, and there's a library up there and some administration offices. So he's expressing function. That's one layer of meaning. And then there also is this big-ass Seattle Art Museum. Okay, it's almost like a billboard. That's another kind of meaning where it's explicitly saying that's what this building is. And as you look at it from different vantage points, you read that kind of complexity. It isn't a one-liner building. It isn't easy to just absorb in a moment. And it is referring, this is a very rich part of downtown Seattle. And there are retail shops all the way around here. And there's something in the building that's reflecting the nature of retail at the lower level, penetrability, pedestrian-friendly environments. That's very much in the building too. So it's the outside in, it's the inside out. These are up at the top because there's fantastic views of Puget Sound from up here. So that's again reflecting a kind of character of the context. And as you get to know this building more and more, you just see this richness, layers and layers of decision making and meaning that really make the architecture. Those lower levels and the ornament on them, as well as kind of seeming like the scale of retail environments, they're ornamented with elements that are really drawn from Native American art in the Pacific Northwest. So it's kind of regional vocabulary that they're using, the colors and the patterns that they're using there. All of that is along one side of the museum on the sidewalk as it moves from the lower street to the upper street and has that retail facade. But on the inside, it's reflecting exactly the same movement between a front door on the upper street and a front door on the lower street, and the stair that connects the two, and the stair being a kind of exhibition space for some of these magnificent Asian pieces that the museum owned and became a kind of gallery for them. In the middle of that sequence, you enter the building, and that's where there's an auditorium and a cafe. So it really is serving a kind of retail function. You can enter at the upper part, you can enter at the lower part, you can enter at the middle part, and all of them are connected and take you to different parts of the museum. Then upstairs, these are really magnificent exhibition spaces, beautifully scaled to the collection they had. And it's a very eclectic collection. Sometimes it's sort of South Pacific native pieces of art, and they're in one kind of environment that's very kind of just stand back and let these pieces stand out. In other areas where it's more classical painting, you get environments that seem room-scaled and domestic as the environments where these paintings would originally have been. And then by the time you get up to the top, you get these spectacular views. This is that little library. You can see Puget Sound. And it's a complex building. It's very complicated in many ways. But all of it is layers and layers and layers of meaning and logic and understanding and reflection of context and reflection of function. And that's really for Venturi what makes a rich and interesting building, is one that has all that depth. The eighth and final point I want us to be discussing in class has to do with this notion of wholeness or unity. And as well as being complex, Venturi does believe in some attitude toward wholeness or unity. So he says, the obligation toward the whole does not preclude the building which is unresolved. A building can be more or less incomplete in the expression of its program and its form. So to be whole, it doesn't have to be tidily whole. He also says an architecture that can simultaneously recognize contradictory levels should be able to admit the paradox of the whole and the fragment. And this is the most important part. He says, the building which is a whole at one level and a fragment of the greater whole at another level is perhaps the ideal. A building which is a whole on one level and a fragment of a greater whole at another level. And this, to his mind, makes a good urban building, so that it becomes part of a larger whole of the city and still a fragment and a whole on its own. So to explore that, let's look at the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery that Venturi and Scott Brown did in 1991. And this is, I don't know, maybe to me the best building they ever did. This was a very controversial situation. There was a big competition. 5 world-renowned architects were invited to submit for this competition. Venturi was not one of them. That competition was won by SOM in Chicago, and it was for a very modern, very striking building that sat right here next to the old National Gallery building right here and right on Trafalgar Square. So this was very controversial. When the competition was finished and the winner was announced, Prince Charles, who has a very strong set of ideas about architecture, said that that looked like a carbuncle on the face of an old friend. So Trafalgar Square being the old friend, and like it had just grown a big ugly mole or carbuncle on its face. So that was actually enough to kill that project. So the SOM building was not built. Now, they sort of reframed the whole thing. And they actually went to Venturi and hired him to do a building that would be markedly new and a distinguished piece of architecture in its own right, but at the same time that would have something to do with Trafalgar Square and have something to do with the original National Gallery building. And I think that's fair enough. Maybe you don't want to go as far as Prince Charles wants to go, but it was something I think many people in London thought was appropriate. So this is the building that came out of that. And it's a very interesting play on taking elements of the facade of the old National Gallery building, and then in the new building that starts right here, beginning with a kind of reiteration, and then slowly dissolving that to come into a building that is, in the end, a pretty much modern building for the portion of it down here. So there is that existing building. Then there's a distinct slice right there, which is an urban design move, and then a kind of reiteration of those pilasters and architrave. And then very slowly, the architrave turns from kind of literal interpretation of the old building to simplified to, over here, just simply a few cornice lines up at the top of the building on what is otherwise a pretty simple and plain facade. That's the old building right here. This is the gap between the old building and the new building, and that gap is there for a very good reason. There's a real desire line to go from Trafalgar Square to the other points in the city through here, and so they open up the ground floor so you can make that desire line fulfilled, while at the same time taking the circulation of the museum over it in a bridge that goes through there. And then on this side, we'll see is the stair that once you come in the entrance over here, you go up that stair to get into the major gallery level of the building right there. Again, that transition from the old facade and the old window patterns into the new facade and a much sort of crisper, cleaner expression at that part of the building. So you would go in on the ground floor there, very comfortable, very commodious kind of entry, and then up this grand stair, which is lit on one side by that slit that's between the old building and the new building. A little reminiscence of Seattle Art Museum there. On the wall, we have this is actually primarily for Renaissance paintings. And so we have Renaissance artists with their names there, Leonardo, Raphael. And so that's kind of emblematic symbols of what we're seeing inside. And then honestly, the most beautiful galleries I think maybe I've ever seen in an art museum. The sequence of rooms, very, very much room-like spaces for each gallery. And they're lit from above with these clear story skylights so that each of the rooms is just luminous. The light is gorgeous in there. And it is that notion of it is a whole. You feel the whole of the galleries, but you also feel each part distinct. So each fragment is also a whole in itself, but a part of a larger whole. And there has to be a little open-endedness for that to happen. So that happens at the scale of the big building, where you're seeing the new addition. It is part of a bigger whole, but it also is something in and of itself. And then once you get in those galleries, they also are part of a larger whole, but also something in and of themselves. So in class, I want us to discuss these 8 ideas. And you can hate them, you can hate the idea, or you can love them and embrace them and say they're appropriate. You can say, well, maybe that was appropriate for the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but gosh, I don't think that's right to do in 2000 whatever. So think about it, come equipped, and we'll talk about it in class. See you.